The smoke reached him before the screaming did, thick and resinous, carrying on wind that tasted of char and something worse underneath. He crested the ridge with his horse lathered and blowing hard beneath him, and what he saw below made his gut drop like a stone through still water. A homestead burning. Not the whole of it, just the barn, orange flame chewing through timber and hay, throwing sparks up into a sky already bruising toward dusk, purple shading into black at the edges like a wound closing over. And in the yard 3 men on horseback circled a 4th figure crumpled on the ground, whooping and hollering like it was sport. Like a man dying in the dirt was something worth cheering. He didn't ask questions. He never did, not in moments like this. Questions were a luxury for men who had time, and he'd learned long ago that time was the one thing you never had when it mattered most. He put his heels to the horse and came down that slope at a dead run, gravel spitting from beneath the hooves, one hand already finding the walnut grip of his colt, worn smooth from years of exactly this. The first man never heard him coming over the crackle of the fire. The gunslinger's shot took him clean off his saddle before he'd even turned his head, and the second rider wheeled his horse hard, going for his rifle, cursing loud enough to carry over the flames. He wasn't fast enough. Nobody ever was, not against a man who'd made peace with dying a long time ago, and just never quite gotten around to it. The third one was smarter, or maybe just more scared. There was a difference, though it rarely mattered in the moment. He broke and ran for the tree line, firing wild over his shoulder, and the gunslinger let him go, for now. He swung down off his horse before it had even stopped moving, boots hitting dirt hard enough to jar his teeth, and dropped to one knee beside the figure curled in the yard, a boy, 15, maybe 16, blood soaking through his shirt at the shoulder in a dark bloom that kept spreading no matter how the gunslinger looked at it, face gone white as bone under the soot. Eyes wide with the particular kind of terror that doesn't come from pain but from watching your whole world catch fire around you and understanding, for the first time in your life, that the world can simply end. Easy, the gunslinger said, low and rough, pressing his palm hard against the wound, feeling the boy's pulse hammer thin and fast beneath his fingers. Easy now. I've got you. The boy's mouth moved, but no sound came, just breath, ragged and short. Behind them, the barn groaned like something dying, and a support beam gave way, sending up a fresh lump of sparks that lit the yard bright as noon for one terrible second. The gunslinger felt the heat of it scald the back of his neck, and knew he had maybe 2 minutes before the whole structure came down on top of them both, and knew too that somewhere out past the tree line, the third rider was probably already circling back with friends, because men like that never rode alone for long. He got an arm under the boy's knees, another behind his shoulders, and lifted him, a grunt tearing out of his chest at the weight, at the fresh stab of pain from an old wound in his ribs that never had healed right, that woke up screaming every time he asked his body for more than it wanted to give. He carried the boy to the well trough at a dead stagger, laid him down against the cool stone, tore his own shirt sleeve into a strip, and bound the wound tight enough to make the boy cry out through clenched teeth. Who did this? The gunslinger said. Not a question, a demand flat as a closed door. The boy's lips finally worked, cracked and trembling. Colton, he rasped. Silas Colton. Said this was Colton land now. Said my pa should have sold when he had the chance. The name hit the gunslinger like a fist to the sternum, hard enough that for a moment the burning barn, the boy, the blood drying tacky on his hands, all of it went far away, replaced by another fire, another yard. 7 years gone and still burning behind his eyes. Every single night he made the mistake of closing them. Silas Colton. He looked down at the boy, really looked, past the blood and the soot, and saw the shape of a jaw he recognized. A way of holding the mouth that belonged to a woman he'd once loved enough to nearly stay for. Nearly. What's your mother's name, boy? He asked, and his voice came out strange even to his own ears, like it belonged to someone standing just behind him. Ruth, the boy said. Ruth Hargrove. His breath caught, hitched. She's in the house. They took her in the house. The gunslinger closed his eyes for one heartbeat. Ruth Hargrove. Ruth Callahan once, before she married a name that wasn't his. The woman he'd left standing on a train platform in Cheyenne with a ring he'd never given her and a promise he'd never kept because the life he lived wasn't fit for anybody to share, least of all her. 7 years he'd told himself that leaving was the kindest thing he'd ever done for her. 7 years, and here she was, burning. He was on his feet before the thought had even finished forming, moving toward the house at a dead run. And if you'd asked him in that moment what debt he was paying, he couldn't have told you whether it was to her, or to the boy bleeding out by the well, or to the version of himself that walked away 7 years ago and never once looked back. Maybe all three. Maybe a man doesn't get to choose which ghost he's running from when the fire's already lit and the choosing is long past done. What would you have done in his place? A debt 7 years old, a woman you'd already failed once, a house on fire with outlaws inside. Would you have run toward it, full well what it might cost you? Tell me down in the comments. I genuinely want to know. Before the flames close in any further, let me ask you something else. If stories like this one keep your heart sitting up in your throat, do yourself a favor and hit that subscribe button. This channel lives and dies by folks like you sticking around for the next ride, and I promise you the trail only gets rougher from here. Now, back to the fire. The front door was already kicked in, hanging crooked on one hinge. Smoke rolled thick through the front room, stinging his eyes, and through it he heard her voice. Ruth's voice, older now, roughened by years he hadn't been there for, but unmistakably hers, cursing at a man twice her size who had her wrist locked in his fist like he meant to break it. The gunslinger didn't announce himself. He crossed the room in 4 strides and drove the butt of his Colt into the back of the man's skull, dropping him like a sack of grain kicked off a wagon. Ruth staggered back, one hand flying to her throat, and in the orange half-light of the burning front window, she looked at him, really looked, and her face went through disbelief and grief and something that might have been fury, all in the space of a single breath. You, she breathed, like the word itself cost her something. Ruth, you son of a bitch, you left and now you show up when my house is burning? I know. He caught her arm, pulling her toward the door as the ceiling above them began to groan and shed embers like falling stars. I know, and I'll answer for every year of it, I swear to you, but not tonight. Tonight we run. They made it out into the yard just as the roof caved in behind them with a sound like the earth itself breaking open, a wall of heat and sparks driving them both down to their knees in the dirt. When the gunslinger looked up, coughing smoke from lungs that already ached, he counted 5 riders now sitting their horses at the edge of the firelight, rifles resting easy across their saddles, watching the whole scene with the patient amusement of men who'd done this before and would gladly do it again. At the center of them, a man in a black duster sat his horse like he owned the ground it stood on, because in a sense he believed he did. Well now, Silas Colton said, voice carrying easy over the crackle of the dying flames. Didn't expect to find you here. Heard you were dead or near enough to it. Guess rumors lie same as everything else. The gunslinger got to his feet slow, joints protesting, putting himself between Colton's men and the 2 people behind him. Ruth, one hand pressed white-knuckled to her son's shoulder, and the boy himself, pale and swaying but breathing, still breathing. This is Hargrove land, the gunslinger said. Signed, deeded, and none of your business. Colton smiled, and it was not a kind thing to see, more a baring of teeth than any real warmth. Was Hargrove land. Man's dead near a year now, God rest him, and a widow with a sick boy don't hold ground long against men who want it bad enough. I offered fair money. She turned it down. Now I'm offering different terms. Get off this land, the gunslinger said, or I'll put you in it. Colton's smile didn't move, but something behind his eyes went cold and calculating, like a man doing sums. Big talk from a man standing alone in a burning yard. He looked past the gunslinger to Ruth, and something proprietary crept into his voice that made the gunslinger's hand tighten on the Colt without him quite deciding to. I'll be back for what's owed me, Mrs. Hargrove, and next time I won't come with just 5 guns. He wheeled his horse and rode, and his men followed, and the gunslinger stood there in the dying firelight with his heart hammering and the old wound in his ribs screaming, watching them go and knowing with the flat certainty of a man who'd lived this kind of life too long that this had only ever been the opening move. They buried what they could salvage of the night in silence. Ruth tending her son's shoulder by lantern light in the spring house that hadn't burned, the gunslinger keeping watch at the window with his rifle across his knees, saying nothing because there was too much to say and no good order to say it in, not yet, maybe not ever. It was near midnight when Ruth finally broke the quiet. You knew his name before I told you, she said, not looking up from the bandage she was tying off. Colton's. I saw it move across your face. I know him. How? The gunslinger was quiet a long moment, watching the dark tree line beyond the window like it might answer for him. 7 years back, before I ever met you, I rode with men like him. Not him exact, but his kind. Landmen. We cleared families off ground that wasn't ours to clear, and I told myself it was just work, just money. Until one night we burned a house with a family still inside it, and I put a bullet in the man giving the order instead of the ones he told me to put it in. He swallowed, throat tight around the words. I've been running from that decision ever since. Reckon it's only right it finally caught up to me in a barn fire on your land. Ruth's hands had gone still on the bandage. You think this is punishment? I think a debt don't stay quiet forever. I think I owed you an explanation 7 years ago and never gave it, and now I owe your boy his life instead, and maybe that's how it has to even out. That's not how debts work, she said quietly. And you know it. He didn't have an answer for that. Outside, an owl called somewhere in the dark, low and patient, and neither of them said anything else for a long while. They didn't have long to grieve the quiet. 2 nights later, Colton's men rode through Deadwood proper, bold as brass in daylight, and the gunslinger and Ruth were there buying supplies when 3 of them cornered the boy. Daniel. His name was, they'd learned, sitting up now, healing slow. Outside the general store, fists already raised, meaning to finish what the fire hadn't managed. The gunslinger crossed the street in a fury he barely recognized in himself, boots eating up the dirt road, and the fight that followed left one of Colton's men with a broken jaw and the gunslinger with 2 cracked ribs from a boot driven hard into his side. But Daniel walked away breathing, upright, and that was the only ledger that mattered to him. The third confrontation came harder. Colton, furious at the humiliation dealt him in his own town, sent 6 men to the Hargrove place at dawn with torches and coiled rope, meaning to burn what remained and drag Ruth and her boy off the land by force if the fire didn't finish the job first. The gunslinger had guessed he'd come again, and he wasn't alone this time. 2 of Ruth's neighbors, men who'd known her husband and buried their own grief in loyalty to his widow, stood with rifles at the property line. The fight that followed was ugly and close and cost them everything they had to give. It cost them Amos Doyle, a widower neighbor with a kind laugh and a bad hip that made him slow to duck, who took a rifle ball meant for Ruth and died in the dirt before sundown with her hand pressed hard to his chest, both of them knowing there was nothing left to be done about it. The gunslinger killed the man who'd fired that shot with a grief-driven fury that frightened even himself. Something dark and total he didn't recognize until it was already over. When it was done, Colton's remaining men fled back toward town, and the yard went quiet except for Ruth's weeping over a man who'd only ever tried to help her. They buried Amos Doyle at sundown, the sky gone the color of a fresh bruise, and the gunslinger stood at the graveside with his hat in his hands, feeling the weight of one more death added to a ledger he'd never balance, no matter how many burning barns he ran into or debts he tried to repay. This won't stop, Ruth said that night, staring into the fire, Daniel asleep finally in the next room. Colton won't stop till one of us is dead. Maybe all of us. I know, so what do we do? The gunslinger looked at her for a long moment, at the exhaustion carved into her face, the grief sitting behind her eyes, and beneath it, still, something that had survived 7 years and a war and a dead husband and a burning barn. The same steel he'd fallen for the first time he'd ever met her. We end it, he said, tonight. Before he brings a whole army down on this house, he rode into Deadwood alone under a moon thin as a blade, and found Colton and what remained of his crew drinking in the back room of the Prairie Rose Saloon. 6 men, loose and confident, certain their numbers alone made them untouchable. He didn't draw on them, not yet. He walked in slow, hands loose at his sides, boot heels quiet on the sawdust floor, and let the room go still around him the way a room does right before something breaks. 7 of us used to run together, he said, and his voice was flat and cold in a way that made even Colton's hardened men go silent. 7 years back. You remember that job, Silas? The Hargrove name wasn't the first family we cleared off a piece of land that wasn't ours. Colton's face had gone the color of old ash. I put a bullet in our foreman that night instead of the family he told me to kill, the gunslinger went on. Been running from what that made me ever since. But I'm done running. His hand rested easy near his Colt, and his voice dropped low enough that every man in that room had to lean in to catch it, and the words landed heavier for the quiet, each one dropping like a stone into still water. Dig 7 graves tonight, he said. One for every man in this room and one for what I used to be. Because only one of us is walking out of Deadwood come sunup, and it isn't going to be you." The room exploded into gunfire and chaos, men diving for cover behind overturned tables, lamps shattering into spreading pools of burning oil. The gunslinger moving through the smoke and muzzle flash like something that had already decided it was dead and had nothing left worth protecting except two people back at that homestead. He took a bullet through the meat of his forearm and another that grazed his temple and dropped him hard to one knee. And still he fought, because behind him in that homestead was a woman and a boy who deserved a life that didn't have Silas Colton's shadow lying over every morning of it. It ended with Colton himself, the last man standing, backing toward the door with his revolver shaking in an unsteady hand, and the gunslinger rising from the floor bloodied and unbowed to meet him. "You could have just taken the money," Colton rasped. "You could have just left a widow her land," the gunslinger said, and fired. Colton went down and didn't get back up, and the Prairie Rose Saloon went silent except for the ragged sound of the gunslinger's own breathing, and somewhere outside, the first gray light of dawn beginning to climb over the hills like it hadn't heard the news yet. He rode back to the Hargrove place slow, swaying in the saddle from blood loss, vision narrowing at the edges, and Ruth ran to meet him before he'd even reached the yard, catching him as he slid down off the horse, and he let himself lean on her for the first time in 7 years, and it felt strange as it was to admit, like coming home to a place he'd never actually lived. "It's done," he said. "Colton's dead, his men scattered or buried. Nobody's coming for this land again." She held his face in both hands, checking the wound at his temple with a tenderness that undid something in his chest that had been locked tight since the night he left her, standing on that platform. "You came back," she said, half laugh, half sob, the two sounds tangled together until they were the same thing. "I should have never left." "No," she agreed. "You shouldn't have, but you're here now. That's going to have to be enough." Daniel appeared in the doorway, thin but steady on his feet, and looked at the two of them a long moment before a small, tired smile broke across his face, the first the gunslinger had seen from him since the fire took the barn. They buried Amos Doyle proper the next week, with the whole of the small community turning out to mourn a man who'd given his life for a stranger's cause and never once asked what it would cost him. And when the gunslinger finally healed enough to sit a horse again, he didn't ride on the way he always had before. He stayed. He rebuilt the barn with his own 2 hands alongside Daniel, who was quick to learn and quicker to laugh now that the fear had finally lifted off him like fog burning away in morning sun. And in the evenings he sat on the porch beside Ruth and let the silence between them be something other than 7 years of unspoken regret. There's a kind of debt, I think, that can never truly be repaid. Not with money, not with land, not even with a life laid down in exchange for another. What can be repaid is the choice to stay, to stand, to finally answer for the man you were with the man you become. The gunslinger never did give himself back his real name in that little valley. Some ghosts follow you no matter how far you ride, but he gave a widow her land back, and a boy his future, and himself at long last a home he'd spent 7 years convinced he didn't deserve. If this story rode with you tonight, stick around. There's always another trail waiting just past the horizon on this channel, and I'd be honored to have you along for it. Hit subscribe if you haven't already. Drop a comment and tell me what you'd have done in his place. Or just let me know with a simple 7 if this one hit you the way it hit me writing it. Until the next ride, partner, take care out there.